Welcome to another Tweedy Pubs video. I'm in Fenchurch Street today, a perhaps slightly lesser known corner of the City of London. Going to be seeing what this area has to offer in terms of interesting historic pubs. Pub number one, the East India Arms, very close to Fenchurch Street station. Cheers from the East India Arms. So this current building that we're looking at dates from 1829. Camera's site says that it's a listed building, but I couldn't find the listing entry on the Historic England website. It's a four-storey building in red brick, and it's, I would say, roughly Georgian in style, possibly some early Victorian elements. And it's quite a contrast to the other historic buildings in the area, which are mostly made of Portland stone, and of course an even bigger contrast to the skyscrapers and modern office blocks of the City of London. Let's take a quick look inside. It was difficult to get any interior shots. City pubs are always busy at lunch times, and don't want to be sticking a camera in anyone's face, but I'm not sure much of this interior is particularly old. It's a Shepherd Neame pub today, and it has a lot of familiar Shepherd Neame style pub interior branding in it. A nice hefty bar counter, some fielded panelling in that. Tail end of November, so it has Christmas decorations along the gantry, some mirrors on the gantry there as well with the name of the pub and the name of the brewery. That's all obviously quite modern. There's a nice little corner seating area in the corner of the pub with a lot of dark wood, and there's wood panelling everywhere, and it's a decent sort of pubby pub sort of feeling to it, although I suspect none of this fabric is particularly old. The name of this pub, the East India Arms, derives from the East India Company, a surprisingly old corporate entity that dates all the way back to 1600 and wasn't dissolved until 1874. It had a near monopoly on global trade, particularly between Europe and Asia. Although East India House was relatively close, roughly on the site of today's Lloyd's building on the edge of Leadenhall Market, and some sources say that was probably the reason that this pub is called the East India Arms, I actually think it has more to do with the warehousing that was in this immediate vicinity. The neighbouring streets and alleys were at one time filled with East India Company warehouses. In this 1870s Ordnance Survey map, the pub is marked here with a PH, and nearby are all these bonded warehouses. They would have been filled with all of the goods that the East India Company imported to England from Asia, including tea, dyes, porcelain, silks, and probably a fair amount of narcotics. So it's likely when the pub first took its name in the 1820s, many of its customers would have been the warehousemen, the porters, and likely a hefty retinue of security staff that worked at those nearby bonded warehouses. Blohm and Stripes map, which dates to somewhere between 1694 to 1720, shows a Magpie Alley, and that's now known as St Catherine's Row. That was very likely named for the former incarnation of this pub as, at least at one time, the Magpie Ale House. In that form, it may have gone all the way back to 1645. In the 1811 directory listing, the pub's name is given as the Magpie and Punch Bowl. It's a Shepherd Neame pub today. I had a half of Spitfire. Pub number two, here in the railway arches, the Cheshire Cheese. Cheers from the Cheshire Cheese. There's some sort of alarm going off in the background. It's quite annoying. It's hard to think of a pub that is in railway arches, as this one is, as being particularly old. But even the current incarnation of this pub building dates back to the 1850s at least. And there has actually been a pub on this site going back much further than that. The pub frontage is spread across these three arches, constructed in engineering brick. It's interspersed with these lanterns that I would like to say at one time were gas lamps, but looking at some old photos, I think they're actually relatively modern. Hard to determine the age of the wood in these bits of the frontage, the doors and windows, but it's easy to imagine the appearance of this pub would have been roughly similar going back to the Victorian era. They were doing the delivery to the cellar at the Cheshire Cheese back there, so I've found this seat a little way away, which is a bit quieter, to come and do the rest of the talking bits. The upper parts of those windows are, I suppose, Diocletian, and they provide lighting to what is effectively a kind of mezzanine floor, the upper floor of the interior. Inside, I suspect most of this is pretty modern, and it overall has quite a modern feel to it, but a couple of points of slight interest. I thought the bar back fitting is slightly unusual. It has a central clock housing, which has a presumably very modern, something that looks like a sort of pocket watch, a giant pocket watch affixed to the front of it. But I wonder if the woodwork backing that might actually be a little bit older. And there are these two cabinets with stained glass in that to me look slightly 1930s, at least the style of the stained glass, but all of that could be far more modern than that. The bar counter also kind of interesting. It looks to me as though they originally had a purely matchboard panelled bar counter that they then sort of glued some fielded panelling onto the front of, and it's now painted in a very modern turquoisey blue kind of colour. Not much to report from the rest of the interior. But outside this pub, I actually found it quite atmospheric, particularly on this gloomy day in late November, and that somehow harked back to the Victorian era when I imagine London as being perpetually bathed in smog. Let's talk quickly about the name, the Cheshire Cheese. This was at one time a very popular London pub name, and there are still at least, I think, 3 remaining in London today. It was mentioned, not the pub, the cheese itself, in Pepys's diary, and it was considered to be a cheese of quite good quality in the 17th century at least. That seems to be the heyday of pubs being named the Cheshire Cheese. I think it was probably just a signifier that the pub had some kind of interesting food offering to go with the beer, and it was considered quite a good accompaniment for ale. I think we may actually have something like a former coaching inn here, and it's listed in the New Guide to Stagecoaches, etc. in 1816. It's mentioned in various coaching routes going out of London, including, for example, to Greenwich. Further clues that it may have originally been a coaching inn come in this newspaper mention of 1835, which referred to the pub as Old Established, and they also note that it has several bedrooms and a small yard. It seems when the railway line was first built through here in around 1840, the original pub actually survived for a while. We have a wonderful piece of evidence of this in the form of this sketch from Thomas Hosmer Shepherd. It's held at the London Picture Archive. Unfortunately, I can't show you the original for copyright reasons, so I made my own interpretation of it. Sorry for the childish scribbling. So you can see what looks like a possibly 17th century, I think, timber frame building, cheek by jowl with the original railway bridge. That was sadly later expanded, the railway, in around 1850, and at that point the pub was demolished and moved into the railway arches. By the time of Gode's map of 1887, you can see the pub marked quite unusually with a PH for public house, with a note that it is under the station at that time. The Cheshire Cheese is operated by Stonegate today. I went for a half of Timothy Taylor's Landlord. Pub number 3, the Crutched Friar. Cheers from the Crutched Friar. Get that the right way around. Look, Harvey's Sussex best. Happy days. This is a modern pub, probably just dating to the late 1990s. The earliest reference I could find for it was in the 1999 London Evening Standard Bar and Pub Guide, Pub and Bar Guide, whatever it was called. I think that was probably written in 1998. And it mentioned at that time that it was newly opened. The left-hand side, as you're facing the pub, is in stock brick and vaguely Georgian in style. But if you look at some old maps, you can see that that site was actually undeveloped post World War II, possibly had been destroyed by bomb damage. So this is actually a modern building. On the right hand side, red brick, maybe that's early Edwardian, late Victorian, I don't know, could be more modern as well. Interestingly, the pub actually straddles the pair of those buildings. The ground floor of both of those buildings is occupied by the pub, and I doubt there is anything particularly old about the pub frontage. As I said, it has only been in use as a pub for about 25 years or so. Inside there's this interesting central corridor which is brick underfoot, and I suspect that is some remnant of when this was 2 distinct buildings, and that was a passage that probably led to the little patio, the courtyard at the back of the pub, which is now in use as a beer garden. So it's probably not worth talking in too much detail about the interior here, because this is, of course, again, a modern pub. But they've done something slightly interesting with the bar back here. It has this fairly ecclesiastical style of carving. I wonder if, a little bit like the Elephant's Head in Camden, this is actually reclaimed from a church, and probably that is a riff on the fact that this pub takes its name from a monastic house that was just across the road from here at one time. The Crutched Friars were a religious order, and crutched is a corruption of crossed. They were well known for carrying a staff with a crucifix on the top. They had a monastic house here on the south side of this street, now known as Crutched Friars, from 1249, which was dissolved in 1538, around the time Henry VIII was busy doing that sort of thing. I think you can get some sense of the complex on the Agas map of the 1560s, even though it had already been dissolved about 30 years prior to this. Over on the left-hand side there and on the right-hand side, where I'm pointing now, both of those were, I think, areas of the gardens of the original monastic complex of the Crutched Friars. There was actually an earlier pub near here named the Crutched Friar, or Ye Crutched Friars. I know that's technically the Oldie Crutched Friars, it's a thorn, but that wasn't located on this specific site. It was the other side of the bridge from here on the street called Crosswall, and that was demolished in around about 1985, so I don't think we can consider there's any real continuity between these two pubs. It was interesting to note in that London Evening Standard guide to pubs from 1999, was it, that this pub was very busy from the outset, and still at almost 2 p.m. on a weekday there was a pretty decent crowd in there. I think it's probably the beer offering. There were as many as 8 hand pumps on, and I think the pub today is ran by the Stonegate group, who don't always have particularly strong branding in their pubs, so you don't necessarily always know when you're in one. I'm having a half of Harvey's Sussex Best. Pub number 4, the Ship, and the eagle-eyed among you will notice I have featured this pub before. It was in the tail end of the video about the history of crisps in pubs, but I was focusing more on the snack selection at that time, so I didn't really get much time to talk about the interior, the exterior, and the history of this pub. So while I'm in the area, I thought it deserves a revisit. Cheers from the Ship. This is a listed building, so we have notes from Historic England on the exterior. I'm not sure they really do it justice. Surely the star feature here is all this splendid plasterwork, which they simply describe as much carved or moulded decoration. The mainstay of it, particularly between the ground and first floor, are these brightly coloured vines with bright red grapes. Somewhere in the middle of that is the name of the pub, the Ship. That's also repeated in the upper floors between the first and second floor, but also there is much maritime themed decoration here in keeping with the name of the pub, the Ship. There are 2 fish that are slightly reminiscent of those, are they called gurgler jugs, looking down disapprovingly on drinkers in the street like me. And there are also shell motifs in various places, and there is a panel underneath the main window, that bay window at the front, which shows 4 ships. Built in 1887, the current building, I think it's still looking rather spectacular. There are definitely some modern touches to the interior, but it does still have a very pubby pub feel. I think, as I probably noted before when I was here for the crisps video, there is this collection of sailors' hats hanging from the beams. Other things that caught my eye on this particular occasion include this lovely roundel in the door. That's actually on the first floor in stained glass with the name of the pub. It's all quite woody. There are some nice little nooks and corners, and it's still pretty busy even after 2 p.m. on a weekday afternoon, which is good to see. So why is this pub here on Hart Street called the Ship? We've already alluded to the bonded warehouses of the East India Company, and in the 19th century this area would have been something akin to an inland dock. So it could be that the name of the ship here relates to those warehouses and those products that had been shipped from overseas. A more likely explanation, though, if we go further back in time to John Rock's map of 1746, we can see that the Navy office was located here to the south of this street, Crutched Friars. It was located here from 1655 until 1786, when it moved to Somerset House. This was Samuel Pepys' office in his role as the clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board, and he also lived here in a house on this site for a time. So my guess is the name of the pub probably relates to the proximity to that office. There's a possible mention as early as 1749 if you accept some fluidity between Hart Street and Crutched Friars. And actually I think Crutched Friars is sometimes used as an area name. In this 1840 directory listing it's referred to as the Old Ship, which suggests it had been around for a while already by that point. This is an independent pub today, I believe, a free house, and that's very much part of its appeal. I went for a half of Harvey's Sussex Best. Pub number 5, the Ship in Talbot Court. Cheers from the Ship on Talbot Court. There is always something a bit special about pubs down alleyways, and this is a fine example of the breed. Today the pub frontage is all black with gold coloured trimmings. I assume they're brass, possibly copper, and that does seem to be somewhat in keeping with the theme of many Nicholson's pubs. It curves around the corner of Talbot Court and has a total of 3 entrances today, which probably attest to the fact that, as usual, originally the internal space was divided into 3 distinct spaces, quite possibly the usual public bar, saloon bar and private bar. And there is this nice semicircular ironwork bracket that supports a lamp above one of the doors. Inside, the curve following the shape of Talbot Court can also be seen in the bar counter and the gantry above it. That has some chunky fielded panelling and some hefty columns supporting the gantry. There's also a set of snob screens at one end of the bar, although I suspect they're actually a modern reintroduction, but they're certainly something that may well have been here in that Victorian era. Overall, I could just about believe some elements of this bar counter are Victorian. There is some carving in the bar back behind the bar. There is a nice frieze with, I suppose, floral decoration in there, and again that could potentially be Victorian. There's also this nice partition which has a little bit of a feeling of age by the staircase, and an interesting spiral-ish staircase leading up to the upper floor, which is more of a dining area today. Various sources, including the sign on the front of the pub, claim that this pub was originally on the site of an inn, possibly a coaching inn called the Talbot, which is sometimes cited as being a corruption of the Tabard. I'm not entirely convinced that that was the case here. There certainly was a Talbot Inn in Southwark, and that is better documented than the one over the river here into the city of London. And I wonder if Talbot Court may just have been named for one of the many notable figures in history that had that surname Talbot. It is apparently of French origin. For example, someone like John Talbot, who was the Earl of Shrewsbury. The pub sign also mentions that the pub was subsequently rebuilt after the Great Fire of London and then renamed the Ship, and that was to note the dock workers who regularly drank here. That could well be the case, that could be the origin of the name here, but if we look at, for example, the Agas map of the 1560s, probably some time before this pub was established, at least with its current name, we are set some way back from where the docks would have been at that time. It's not impossible that they would have walked a few streets away to find a pub that they particularly liked. Moving forward to the 1799 map from R. Hallward, you get a little bit of a better sense of the wharf and quay buildings that existed at that time, and they're in the run of riverside buildings, including Billingsate Market. So there has been a pub on this site of this name for at least 250 years. Here's the earliest newspaper mention I could find, and that dates to 1767. It's a particularly fun one as well. The publican at the time, Mr. Stiff, took a bet that he could walk all the way to Maidenhead, I don't know why they chose Maidenhead, and back from his pub in the space of 24 hours. According to the article, he did have some challenges to overcome, including the badness of the weather, and had to stop at several other houses. I think he means other pubs, so it turned into a bit of a pub crawl along the way, but made it back with 2 hours to spare. And the article also notes that he was of great age at that time, so a 50 to 60 mile round walk from here to Maidenhead and back, pretty impressive. Note also the word senite here, that particularly grabbed my attention. I think that is a pair with the word fortnight. It's fallen out of use in the language. Fortnight is a contraction of 14 nights, meaning 2 weeks, and senite with the long S, that's not an F, that's a long S, is a contraction of 7 nights. It's an old-fashioned way of saying a week. I'm really quite taken with the Ship here in Talbot Court. Amazingly, this is actually the first time I have been to this pub. I thought I knew this area quite well. It is, as I think I mentioned earlier, a Nicholson's pub today. There was quite a varied lineup on the bar, 8 hand pumps in total. Not many of them particularly grabbed me, so I just went for a safe choice with a half of London Pride. That is going to be it for this week's video from here in front of the ship in Talbot Court. As I said at the start, perhaps slightly lesser known area of the City of London, but I do think there's some interesting history and some interesting pubs here. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.